sorry I wasn't there when you needed me.
You were exactly where you were supposed to be.
Bullet points. 2 words that comprise the core of why this season failed so fundamentally. It's clear that George provided Dan and Dave with a bulleted list containing major plot points of the remainder of the series, trusting in their ability to effectively write them into fruition. This was an immense miscalculation on George's end, for little did he know that the showrunners he placed so much faith in, the showrunners that produced 7 incredible seasons, had become disinterested in the very story they were trying to tell. Now I get it. Working on a creative project for roughly 10 years is inarguably exhausting, let alone a visual piece of this scale. Dan and Dave were clearly ready to wrap up their adaptation of A Song of Ice and Fire and to move on to A Galaxy Far, Far Away. HBO offering them a full 10-episode season and them simply declining is only fuel to the fire of this notion. Regardless, Dan and Dave took on a responsibility. They chose to carry out this project, to tackle the daunting task of adapting the greatest novel series of all time. No one forced them to do this. The way they let their growing disinterest blatantly slip into the final product, the final season of what was shaping up to be the greatest show of all time, is appalling. I've said this before in my breakdowns of the season, but I've lost all respect for Dan and Dave as fellow creatives. The series finale of Game of Thrones, The Iron Throne, proves that they fundamentally misunderstand the nature of the work they are adapting. This episode, no, the entire season, has not only abandoned but blatantly contradicted the core thematicism of George R. R. Martin's writing. I think no element of this episode better exemplifies the failure of this finale and the season as the whole than the melting of the Iron Throne. Now, before you all buy plane tickets, come to my house, and beat the shit out of me, I should probably clarify the actual scene itself was incredible. Drogon melting the Iron Throne was a perfect thematic climax for the series. This was so close to being perfect, until they immediately contradict the point they just made in the next scene. When Sam suggests moving toward a more democratic system of government, he is scoffed at and laughed off by his fellow lords in favor of simply crowning another monarch. What was the point of the previous scene? What was the point of the thematic core of the entire series? What was the point of this show? That's just it. There isn't one. Thanks to lazy abandonment from the showrunners, George's message was never able to come to fruition to achieve full implementation in the narrative of the show. That is why I had such issue with the handling of the Night King, or lack thereof. That is why I despise the rushed character assassination of Daenerys and everything she stood for. That is why I hated this finale and the final season as a whole. The entire story was for nothing. Don't get me wrong, there were some elements of the finale that I loved, but I'll do exactly what Dan and Dave did, throw a bolded list at you. Tyrion's emotional breakdown and subsequent abandonment of Dany was absolutely flawless and, once again, should instantly secure Peter Dinklage an Emmy. The shot of Drogon spreading his wings directly behind Dany was one of the best feats of cinematography in the entire show. Brienne finishing Jaime's entry in the White Book, the book chronicling the lives and feats of various Lord Commanders of the Kingsguard, was so satisfying. Fans of the show and books alike have been predicting this scene, and it was tear-jerking to see it actually play out on screen. The conclusion to Arya, Jon, and Sansa's arcs were handled flawlessly. They implemented the natural, logical conclusion to each of their book and show arcs. It was great to see a narrative progression building for 8 seasons actually conclude. But the good, despite being masterful, nowhere near outweighs the bad. Quite the opposite, in fact. To see the knife twist even further into the disgustingly handled character assassination of Daenerys was heartbreaking. They turned a character who I had wholeheartedly stood by for 8 seasons and 5 books into essentially the Westerosi equivalent of Hitler. Her appalling rhetoric contradicts everything she has stood for as a character. Not to repeat last week's analysis verbatim, but again, this shift could very well have worked if it was actually written. There was none of the developmental tissue needed to carry out this arc, none of the time and careful build-up I trust George to intricately craft if he plans on taking this route in the novels. Rather, we got a split-second decision in the wake of only half an episode of build-up to turn one of the best people ever into one of the worst, and you try to tell me that's believable? Almost as believable as Drogon just choosing not to burn Jon, despite Jon having clearly killed Dany. Speaking of Dany's death, who took the throne in her place, and the logic behind his ascension is even more absurd. Bran would make a horrible king. He's physically incapable of human empathy. He has become an alternate Littlefinger of sorts, incapable of emotion unless feigning it to influence behavior. You expect him to be a just king that cares for his subjects? Do you remember last season when he abandoned Mira? When he simply sent away the girl who accompanied him on his entire journey without as much as a thank you? Now you mean to tell me that this man would make a good king? Also, the line, "Why do you think I came all this way?" radiates with implication. Since episode 1 of the season, Bran has been influencing behavior to create the domino effect that would climax in Dany's genocidal turn. If he set this all in motion without concern for the thousands of innocents that would perish, he is just as evil as she was made out to be. How did Tyrion, one of the smartest individuals on the show, not put these puzzle pieces together? I want to end this breakdown with one scene in particular. This episode unintentionally contains a metaphoric conveyance of the very failure at the core of this season. In predicted Lord of the Rings fashion, Sam presents Tyrion with a copy of A Song of Ice and Fire. Only it wasn't written by Sam, but a maester we've never heard of. Only it was a dry military history book, not containing any of the fantastical nuance that the title implies. Only it fails to include Tyrion, one of the primary players in the whole saga, for the sake of a gag. Dan and Dave presented George with Game of Thrones, an adaptation of his masterpiece. Only it wasn't the narrative George intended, but a shallow husk fueled by bullet points. Only it abandoned all the thematic architecture and character progression that George crafted at the core of his series. Only it failed to conclude this progression in favor of writing decisions that would shock audiences and appear cool in the fleeting moment. It is with this point that I declare that the Professor of Thrones is no longer a Game of Thrones channel. My mission is no longer to explain the appeal of Game of Thrones, to convince fans of the show to explore its deeper layers, the nuance lying beneath the surface. I've come to realize that what lies below the show is in fact an empty abyss. There is nothing to teach, nothing to profess. Instead, this will be a Song of Ice and Fire channel. My new mission is to explain that the books are the true work of value, not the show. I will strive to steer people away from the popularity of the show and into the light that is the Song of Ice and Fire novel series and all of its supplementary material. The game may have ended in failure, but the song is far from over. I hope that, despite the show having concluded, you'll join me in the next stage of my journey. I hope that you'll continue to allow the Professor of Thrones to teach you.
グレン・ラガンスピンオン俺を誰だと思ってる